Did you charge it?
No, from I flew into.
Oh. Then you're gonna drive across to Kansas City for your next one.
Yeah, tomorrow.
Okay.
Flying.
Are you taking, you're gonna take the highway of the American Genius? It's
I've
a
got a friend who lives halfway.
interesting little route.
Okay, I'll look for that.
Mm. It goes across, it's kind of an elevated euphemistic designation, but technically it's, Walt Disney and Jason, many American geniuses came from the
Okay.
route. So they really try to hype it up, get people to drive it. It
Perfect.
is less congested, which is nice. But it's
What's the highway number?
30.
30, okay.
It's in 36. Oh, I'm at 36, you're right. Yeah, it's kind of, it's more scenic.
Mhm.
It's not exactly exciting, but sometimes there's unexpected things.
Yeah.
The almost sliced bread is on it, so lots of well, that's what I'm thinking is 70s. Blah, you know what I mean? Welcome to Missouri.
Are we ready?
Yeah, okay.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, including our virtual attendees that have joined us from wherever they are in the world. I'm Shane Mullen, I'm the event coordinator for Landless Books, and we are very proud to present award-winning author Chris Latreille to celebrate his beautiful, big-hearted book, Becoming Little Big Shell. Both personal and historical, Becoming Little Shell is. Did I say it?
That's a new one, Little Big Shell.
I'm like, pretty certain I just added a word in there. Becoming Little Shell is a testament to the power of storytelling, to family and legacy, and to finding home. Infused with candor, heart, wisdom, and an abiding love for a place and a people, Chris Latreille's remarkable journey is both revelatory and redemptive. Tonight is possible because of your support. When you support Landless Books, you not only are helping us keep our doors open, you're helping us bring in incredible authors like Chris, but you are also putting money directly back into the local economy. You are helping keep the parks free, the museums in the park free and open, and you are also doing things like helping pave streets and keeping our community as good as it can be. So we thank you for spending your money locally, for helping us stay open and be the oldest and largest independent bookstore in St. Louis. I am going to tell you, I forgot to write down the date, but we do have Michael Thomas coming up for an event that I'm really excited about. I believe it is on October 10th, if I'm not mistaken, but I probably am because I have a lot of dates in my head. And we just announced an event with Matt Barnett and Sean Harris today, so I have been all over the place. So we have a lot of really good things going on, so be sure to check out our event calendar for an event for any type of reader. We do have a wide, very wide array of books that we are presenting in the month of October. I am going to tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to welcome our guests. Becoming Little Shell, a Landless Indian's Journey Home. Winner of the Pacific Northwest Book Award, winner of the Reading the West Book Award, a People and Esquire Best Memoir of the Year. Growing up in Montana, Chris Latreille always identified as an Indian. Despite the fact that his father fiercely denied any connection, he found Indigenous people alluring, often recalling his grandmother's consistent mention of their Chippewa heritage. When Latreille attended his grandfather's funeral as a young man, he finally found himself surrounded by relatives who obviously were Indigenous. Who were they, he wondered, and why was I never allowed to know them? Combining diligent research and compelling conversations with authors, activists, elders, and historians, Latreille embarks on a journey into his family's past, discovering along the way a larger story of the complicated history of Indigenous communities, as well as the devastating effects of colonialism that continue to ripple through surviving generations. And as he comes to embrace his full identity, he eventually seeks enrollment with the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians, joining their 158-year-long struggle for federal recognition. Both personal and historical, Becoming Little Shell is a testament to the power of storytelling, to family and legacy, and to finding home. Infused with candor, heart, wisdom, and an abiding love for a place and a people, Chris Lattre's remarkable journey is both revelatory and redemptive. I said it twice. Doing great over here. All right, and now we have our speakers. I would like to introduce first Sarah Kenzior, our conversation partner for this evening. Sarah is the best-selling author of The View from Flyover Country, Hiding in Plain Sight, and They Knew, and most recently,
Last American Road Trip.
when you don't write things down, it's hard to remember them. She lives with her husband and children in St. Louis, Missouri. Chris Lattre is a Métis storyteller, a descendant of the Pembina band of the Mighty Red River of the North, and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. He is also the author of One Sentence Journal, short poems and essays from the world at large, which won the 2018 Montana Book Award and a 2019 High Plains Book Award, as well as Descended from a Travel-Worn Satchel, a collection of haiku and haiban poetry. Lattre is the Montana Poet Laureate for 2023 through 2025, and a former bookseller at Fact and Fiction. He writes the weekly newsletter, An Irritable Métis, and lives near Frenchtown, Montana. Now, would you all please help me in warmly welcoming our fantastic guests for the evening?
Right. I guess we can use the mic. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here. Hope you're enjoying St. Louis thus far. To get right into it, I was wondering if you could tell us about the process of deciding to write this book. If I'm remembering correctly, you decided in 2014, and if you could just sort of bring us through that whole process from the inspiration to the fruition.
Sure. Well, I'm going to begin with kind of a traditional introduction, which I always like to do, that also sets the tone for what the book is about. So I will say, bonjour, bonsoir, hello and good evening, all of my relatives. Chris Lattre, Indigenous Cause, Chris Caution, Shin. My name is Chris Lattre, but you may call me Chris. And I said that in the two languages of the Little Shell people. So we are Anishinaabe, and we speak Anishinaabe-Moan, or Ojibwe-Moan, or Ojibwe, or Chippewa, all different words for the same thing, which is who we are and what our language is. And then we also speak Michif, which is the language of the Métis people. The Métis people are a cultural indigenous group recognized in Canada as one of the three indigenous peoples who predate the existence of Canada as a country. So it's the Métis, the First Nations, and the Inuit people. We also predate the existence of the United States, but the United States does not recognize us as a cultural indigenous group at all. And I always like to point out, we didn't cross the border crossed us. So that story and who the Little Shell are is largely what this book is about, with my family history threaded through it. And now to get to answer your question, in the introduction, it was mentioned that, my father and grandfather denied that we were Native at all. And people want to talk to me about this book like it's some kind of a discovery of identity. It really wasn't, because I identified as Chippewa from the beginning, because Grandma always said we were. But, when you're a kid and Dad says one thing and Grandma says the other, who are you going to believe? You're going to believe Grandma, right? If you know how to be a family. So I believed Grandma, and it wasn't until I got older that I realized, when my grandfather died and the church is full of Indians, that the story I'd been told my whole life was just a fraction of the truth. So that was the interest. And, I'd been wanting to write. In fact, I stopped by earlier today at Subterranean Books because I was in an anthology that they published more than a decade ago called Noir at the Bar, because I thought I was going to be a crime writer, and I've been published in all these anthologies, and I did a live Noir at the Bar at some bar here in St. Louis however many years ago, and I hadn't had a chance to come back to that. So I was already writing, but as writing paths go, it kind of meandered, and all of a sudden I found myself writing poetry, and this story was the one that was always churning in my head. And there's a moment in the book where I tell this guy that I'm going to write a book, and that was the first time it had ever come out into the, even to myself, that it was going to happen. And that was 2014 or something like that.
So, I mean, one thing that's interesting to me of this book is that you're writing it during this period in the United States where there's suddenly this interest in the accurate history of our nation, in things like Native American genocide, enslavement of African peoples. And there's more, for a while, more of a receptiveness to these harsh truths. Now we're kind of in this backlash phase that I think kicked off around 2021, 2022. I was wondering, you are telling your own story and also learning parts of your own story, learning parts of your tribal history, a broader indigenous history. How has that process been to have that happening during this, period of intense political turmoil and censorship?
I tell people that right now it's a better time to be an indigenous person here in Turtle Island than it has been for about 500 years because we have representation in places we've never had. It's like when I was a kid, if I wanted to see an Indian in a TV show or in a movie or whatever, it was some white dude dressed up like an Indian. And now kids have like reservation dogs, where they can see, native stories written by native people. Everybody behind the camera is native, and the people in the story are native, living lives that native kids can relate to. And that representation is so important. Joy Harjo in that time period was appointed the first native poet laureate of the United States in the history of poets laureate of the United States. And I think there's definitely a backlash in certain elements that we are not going to back away from. So I take it head on, so just in fact, last weekend I was out in, at the South Dakota Book Fair, and there's these two white guys who have made their career writing stories they're stealing from native people. And one guy spent half his presentation talking about why he thinks it's okay for him to write these books based on indigenous spirituality and telling like his most recent book is about boarding schools, while the next room over, someone whose family was actually in boarding schools is over there telling her story. And I don't pull any punches when it comes to taking that thing on. I'm not alone in that. I think we've reached a point where there are a lot of folks who are looking at, indigenous ways of being and knowing stuff and realizing that maybe the people who've been here for 15,000 years know a thing or two about how to live here. And, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is a global sensation. So while there's these, loud voices yelling into bullhorns over here, I think at the kind of grassroots level, there's a point we've crossed that we are not going to retreat from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most meaningful things that I've gotten from your book and from other books, because as some of you know, I write about autocracy, and I started out writing about foreign autocracy, in the states of the authoritarian states of the former USSR, and comparing them to the United States. And a lot of people thought that was sort of an incredulous, unrealistic comparison. Now we're suddenly in this era where people are admitting, of course, authoritarianism is, possible in the United States, and it's happening in the United States. But what they look for is an antecedent is, Hitler or Stalin or some other, foreign example. But one of the points that I tried to stress earlier is that when autocracy comes to the United States, it's going to be an extension of the authoritarianism that came before, in particular towards Black Americans and also the attempted genocide of Native Americans. And I was wondering, what lessons do you think Indigenous people have to offer to combat this kind of political system and also the environmental crises? Because from what I've seen, Native folks have been much more on the ball, kind of in terms of understanding what is happening to our climate and figuring out creative ways to respond to, what we've been dealt being born into this era.
Yeah, I would like to see it like a little bit more focused, because we do have a lot of Indigenous people doing that work. I mentioned Robin, there are others, but if we want to think of us as a community, so like my friend Peter Stark, he lives in Missoula. He's kind of a history writer now. Started out as an adventure writer for like Outside magazine and stuff like that. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Gallop Towards the Sun, which is about William Henry Harrison and Tecumseh. So we're going back a couple hundred years, and Tecumseh was a Shawnee guy who tried to get all the tribes to work together to repel, the push westward of the United States. And, he almost pulled it off. And if it wasn't for a couple cowardly English commanders during the War of 1812, who knows what our society would look like now. And that's the problem, is we are still a deeply colonized people, and even our governments are governments that were handed to us as a blueprint by the United States. And part of it for us is for us to reestablish ourselves to something a little more traditional ourselves. So while we have representatives of indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge, as we call it, TEK, you've arrived when you've got your own, initialism or whatever they call it, but yeah, we have that. And I believe that we are part of whatever the solution is going to be, but we don't necessarily have all the answers ourselves either. And that's one of the frustrating things I face is, we were talking about the national parks earlier. As we're both big fans, going around and seeing national parks. And I'm involved in a couple groups that are working towards the re-indigenization of Yellowstone National Park, the idea of which was actually offered by Park Superintendent Cam Shawley, who in 2022 was the 150-year anniversary of the establishment of Yellowstone. And he said, okay, the next big initiative is going to be re-indigenizing this, because we recognize that the last thing we did is pushed all the natives out. And the Park Service recognizes 27 tribes as having somehow interacted with the park, lived there, hunted there, whatever. The tribes ourselves, we recognize about 60. But even getting a dozen of us in a room to talk to the Park Service, trying to wrangle that cat situation into any kind of forward motion is very difficult. Because you can say, well, let's rename this river, who's named after the general Gibbon, who chased the Nez Perce all the way through, the park and all the way to Canada. Well, let's rename this to the indigenous name. Well, whose? When you've got 27 that the park is willing to talk to versus the 60, those are challenges, even just among our own kind of people, to use a broad brush of all the tribes involved. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, I would like to talk more about the national parks. If that's
Yes,
you,
love to.
because we both enjoy visiting them, and they are one of these.
Do you have a stamp thing? Do you collect the stamps and the stickers?
We were for a while,
Okay.
and then because of COVID, just everything got, we lost all of that. I was going to do I had a son that was in 4th grade in 2020. We are going to get that discount, but alas, there are much worse things that happened that year, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But the national parks are one of the few things that basically all Americans agree is a good idea. National parks, postal service, which is why I find it so alarming that this administration, both Trump terms, comes out off the bat. One of the first things they want to do is attack the national park system, eliminate the national parks, open it up for drilling, opening up for mining. And this is a clear indication to me that they are not trying to seek public approval, and therefore they are not worried about having free and fair elections in which our opinion actually matters. But then there's another side of this equation beyond just kind of the American and international tourism, which is that these are often sacred sites for Native peoples, including for ancient peoples, Pueblo civilizations, and so forth. And the ability to preserve those monuments intact is in jeopardy. And I'm wondering, kind of, given that they're under attack yet again, how do you see all of this potentially playing out, in the next few months or year?
I think it depends on the park. It's like the Blackfeet Nation, who are on the eastern edge of Glacier Park, the northeastern part of it. They've been, like during COVID, they shut it down. They shut access down from their side. So while all these people on the west side, you drive by and all the boat put-ins and stuff, and everybody was just, you could practically see COVID gurgling in these crowds of people. On the east side, the Blackfeet were like, no, you can't come here. And one of their most sacred sites is Chief Mountain in Glacier Park. And they have just recently said, you can't go to Chief Mountain. We're closing it off because we'd go there to do ceremonies and there'd be all these people. And we can't let you, you failed in your privilege to be able to go there. it's like a parent saying, well, you had a chance and you blew it. So there, but then you go somewhere like Yellowstone, which, not so much, like I can use my tribal ID. That's one of the things that's changed. I can use my tribal ID to get, I thought it was any park, national park, but I've learned that it's only some. But like I was in Shenandoah and I said, hey, I'm using my tribal ID. And the kid was like, well, I don't know that works here. And I kind of did the Obi-Wan Kenobi, yes, trick on him and it worked. But Yellowstone, it's not just the park itself. Everything around it is so expensive. You sit down to have a burger, like if we went and had a burger together, it's like $50, by the time we roll out of there. And that's not even without, a couple beers or whatever. So it's this whole idea, it's like a microcosm of the United States of access, who has it and who doesn't. And depending on the park, Grand Canyon has its own issues. But I do believe these places are sacred. And I think even non-native people can feel that. Like Yellowstone, people come away and they're like, there's just something about this place. And there is. And for me, it's like the tattoos on my forearm are the 7 grandfathers. So as Anishinaabe people, we have the 7 grandfather teachings, which is like our code for how we're supposed to live our life. And each one is represented by an animal. Yellowstone is one of the only places, there's only 2 places that I know of that I can go where all 7 of them still live together in community. Yellowstone is one of them, and the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes Reservation is the other. And I think that, to get a little woo, that spiritual power is something we can feel. If you go to a place like that and you're open to letting that part give you what it's willing to give, you're going to get it. And I think that is somewhere in that is the seed for, bringing us all together.
Yeah, I agree. And to show how much I agree, I'm just going to quote you to yourself. You wrote about being out in the wild world, which still exists. You say, I make a point to be out in that world whenever I can, in forests, on riverbanks, even immersed in the cold water, in hopes that whatever whispered to my people from those places is still there whispering to me. I'm doing my best to listen. And this, that paragraph, just that little section really resonated with me because I have these same sort of experiences. But also, famous Missourian, George Washington Carver, he wrote extensively about this, that he was a botanist. But when he wrote about, plant and agricultural life, it was done in some sort of abstract way. He said that if you love something enough, if you love the natural world enough, it will reveal to you its secrets. If that's something that you feel, do you understand?
100%. And then that goes back to our very idea of the original creation of, the world is created. I won't go into the whole story, but, the whole world exists except for one thing. And that one thing is us, humans. And so Kichi Manitou, our creator, our great mystery, creates humans. And the first task that Kichi Manitou gives to that first human, Nanabuju is his name, Nanabush, is to go out in the world and pay attention, to go out in the world and listen, and everything will speak to Nanabuju to tell them who they are and what purpose they serve and what their relationship can be with us as the newest relative. And, for me, growing up and still living outside of any kind of traditional community, I don't have any elders I can go to. And even the elders we have are people who are like the first generations having survived boarding schools where much of our culture and language was eliminated. It's not like someone who's just a couple generations removed from like old school Indians, right? So for me, I've just had to accept that my education as an Anishinaabe people is I have to go back to the original teachers. Those original teachers are the wildlands, the rivers, the trees, and all of those things, because that is where I regenerate. That is where I recharge my energy, whether it's social or creative or anything. Without that, I'm nothing. And I think that speaks to many of us, and I identify as Anishinaabe because in Anishinaabe worldview, we believe everybody is Anishinaabe, going back to Nanabuju, and so that lives in all of us, that connection that many of us have lost. And that is why, you feel it. It's why I'm sure some of you feel it who like to go out on the land. It's why people feel it when they go places like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon or Zion. That energy is there. And again, if you open yourself to it, you learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's kind of a comfort to me, at least while it lasts, because we can go and kind of have this physical, you know, transcendent experience. You know, but one of the things that's, you know, most distressing about American history is that, of course, there's this very, very long tradition of white settlers trying to prevent Native history from being recorded, from being told accurately, from being taught in school. You know, and as you were noting, there was this change, you know, recently, you know, all the way down to pop culture with shows like Reservation Dogs and so forth. Now we're seeing, you know, a backlash that has gone as extensive as rewriting the history of the national parks. You know, like my book, The Last American Road Trip, I thought, finally, I'm writing something that's not going to get banned somewhere, because this is a road trip book, you know, visiting national parks, everybody loves them. Of course, all the stories that I'm writing about inside have to do with, you know, the contributions of Indigenous people, the contributions of, you know, of Black Americans, and so therefore under the Trump DEI banner, this is now a controversial book. You know, I was wondering what you thought of how do we, you know, continue to teach young people, in particular, not just the history of Indigenous people, but kind of the modern contemporary contributions, when there's this top-down effort to suppress them. Because I know, you know, my kids certainly got a lot out of a show like Reservation Dogs. Honestly, I think it was one of the most eye-opening things that they've seen, because it was contemporary life. It wasn't some Dances with Wolves kind of scenario. And I think that that's really important. You know, what kind of ways are there to make sure that that kind of creative work from Indigenous people gets out and the stories continue to get told?
So in Montana, they're obligated by our state constitution, which was redrafted in 1972, and within that constitution is a mandate for Indian Ed for all. So K through university, teachers are mandated to teach true Native history in every subject. And it's taken, you know, 30 years or more to 40 years to really get that going. But that is an initiative that is probably stronger now than since that constitution was written. And I like to tell people, you know, for, you know, as much as a dumpster fire as our current state legislature is, anytime they've tried to you know, disconnect from that, they've been unable to, because we have a very strong Native caucus at the state government level. So in Montana, we're mandated. And, you know, a friend of mine runs a nonprofit called Chickadee Community Services that started, my friend Anna East. She worked on the Flathead Reservation for 20 whatever years, and then moved and took a job with the Montana Digital Academy, which is the state virtual school, online school. And that Indian caucus require them to create programs, language programs, online language, tribal language programs with all the tribes in the state. Well, not all the tribes are willing to do it, but my friend Anna is the one who develops those language courses for the state. And then, you know, we were talking one day and she was lamenting that she gets contacted by people who aren't in the K through 12 that want access to that kind of thing. So that is where Chickadee came from. So she created this course called Native American Studies for Teachers, which was an online, like 12-week course for, you know, because teachers come in, they're supposed to teach this stuff and they've never learned it either. So it's a double whammy there. So this class was to prepare teachers to be able to go into schools in Montana and teach, or at least have a basis for what they could teach. Well, then that became Native American Studies for everyone, because people outside of teachers wanted to learn also. And then we got this hairy idea last year to do a festival called Indigipalooza Montana, where we invited a bunch of Native writers and artists to come and have just a big celebration of Native storytelling. And we, you know, Chickadee offered a Native American Studies for Everyone class that if you took it, whatever money you spent, it's like a sliding scale, whatever, you know, amount you were able to afford, donated back to Indigipalooza, and that's largely how we funded it. We didn't have to go out and do the usual things and get grants because there's like 500 some people signed up for this class. So I tell all of this because that is an example, I think, of grassroots. You know, you assholes in DC and in these states, you do whatever you want. We're going to be doing our thing over here, and eventually we will have this groundswell of grassroots movement that will take over. You know, we're not trying to make anybody do anything other than live the lives they want to live, you know, and part of our future, you know, depends on the recognition of our past. And that is what we're out to do. And this coming year, we're doing Indigipalooza again. And, you know, 2026 is the 250-year anniversary. So we're already getting all this, you know, hoo-ha about the greatness of the United States. So we're devoting Indigipalooza to resistance. 250 years of resistance. How have we, you know, thrived, not just survived, but thrived in the face of a document that referred to us as, you know, merciless Indian savages. The goal was to eliminate us, and we're still here. So those stories, I think, are just, like I said, churning at the grassroots, and there's no going back from them.
Yeah, this is going to be quite a year next year. I'm just thinking in terms of road trips. It didn't dawn on me until just now that we're going to be dealing with the 250th anniversary of the United States under the Trump administration. We're also going to be dealing with the 100-year anniversary of Route 66, you know, which is a road that cuts right through, you know, multiple tribal territories in Oklahoma, in New Mexico. It also is, you know, a route that has this dual history of exploiting and you know, taking away territory for those people, but also putting up kind of, you know, teepees and wigwam hotels and all this kind of kitsch. And, you know, one thing that I got a lot out of when I wrote a road trip book after I took a bunch of road trips. It was not something I set out to do. It was an accidental thing. Was watching both these fake representations, but then also being in a place, including up in Montana, and you know, near the Salish reservation, where suddenly all the signs on the road are in that language. And I was just taking photos of all of them and looking them up on the internet later and trying to translate them. There is a site actually that, you know, has it spoken and everything.
And there's a DVD which I'll send you if you would like a copy of it.
I would, because I actually used one of those words in my book, and I had to try to really set that up. And I was recently up in Madeline Island, you know, in the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin, which also is, you know, there's a Chippewa, you know, tribe there, and the Ojibwe people are up there, and the signs are all in, you know, that language as well. And there's something to me that it strikes deeply. Like, I think it's just this continual, constant reminder of who the original inhabitants of this country are, that the languages are different, that the tribes are different, that the cultures are different, that there's entire histories of all of these mini nations within our nation that are not usually taught in school, at least not with great depth. And so I'm just trying to figure out how we have, on one hand, you know, this emerging in more of a mainstream way. And on the other hand, I think what's going to be a top-down effort to make a very, very narrow definition of what it means to be an American, you know, from the Trump administration, that it's going to be white and it's going to center, you know, I guess not just the founding fathers, but probably the Confederate founding fathers and all sorts of, you know, horrific acts. And I mean, you see that recently, really, in a really awful way, with what they're doing with Wounded Knee and how they're giving medals to the people who committed that massacre. You know, what do you make of all these dueling histories? What do you see in store for 2026?
Well, 2026 is we're not the only ones with plans to do some kind of a anti-narrative as it relates to the 250-year anniversary. So Rebecca Nagel is one of the people. She's working on a podcast for that with Nick Estes, who wrote Our Histories of the Future about the damming of the Missouri, and he's a scholar who teaches at the University of Minnesota. So there are other things, and I've heard that there are some Black organizations who are also going to do something. Hey, remember, you know, what really has happened over those 250 years. I like to think that this kind of authoritarian whatever, you know, the closer you get to the end, the more vicious it is. And I like to feel like this is kind of the last gasp of a kind of way to view the world, because population is just, you know, we're already to a point where, white people aren't the dominant population. And I don't like to frame it like that. But the reality is that, we've all been mixing from the first time that one culture crashed into another culture. And this idea of any kind of purity, like these people like to talk about, is also a false narrative, and, like I said, I narrow what I pay attention to the things that I feel like I can really affect. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on that people get all freaked out about, that, like, you go on a river trip. I've encountered this many times where you leave and one thing is what everybody's talking about. Something else happens over the course of even just those 3 or 4 days that the whole world is like freaking out about. And by the time you get off the river, that thing's forgotten and we're on to something else. So there's been like these huge, like, social media blow-ups, like that submarine that sunk and all those people drowned or whatever. I know nothing about that because it rose and fell in the exact beginning and end of a river trip I was on. So, those things happen all the time. But, we have to remember that and I talk about this, I relate it to like when you drive through like Pine Ridge, which is one of the poorest places on the planet, the Pine Ridge Reservation, Lakota people in South Dakota. And if you look for poverty, that's what you're going to find. Just like they used to talk about where we come from, Hill 57 in Great Falls, Montana. If you look for poverty, if you look for illness, you're going to find it. Because what you don't see is that people who are, in kitchens and living rooms and community halls solving the problems. You don't see them unless you know to look for them. Hill 57, yes, there was poverty and illness, but it was also a place where sick people could go and still get traditional treatment that they wanted, because we weren't allowed to do that kind of thing until 1976 or 1978. So yeah, there's a lot of sick people there because they're going there to get their traditional healing. And if you don't realize that, that is all you're going to see. I kind of lost track of what I was actually talking about. I guess my point is there's stuff that's going on, even though the loudmouths get all the energy. A lot of time, like this whole thing with Trump and Hegseth, or how you say his name, addressing all those military guys, it's kind of blowing up in their face. And that's always been the thing. It's like, look at Trump and Musk. Who didn't see that coming? They would have a falling out. It was just like a matter of time. There should have been like a pool, like in football games, everybody buys a square to see when it's going to happen, because you knew it was going to happen. These guys can't get along, and they won't. And as long as we keep meeting in kitchens and community centers and doing these little projects that, overlap together and become bigger projects, I think that is happening and needs to continue to happen.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that you put so much emphasis on grassroots efforts and on people contributing to starting their own creative ventures, their own kind of resistance to this administration, because I do not think that these NGOs and these federal kind of false saviors are going to come through. And I had some sort of question in that I completely lost my train.
Well, and part of it too is what you might consider the left organizations or liberal organizations or whatever label you want to pin on that, I think, tend to be a little cowardly sometimes.
Yes.
Too. So like my book is the Big Reads or Great Reads from Great Places. It's a thing that the Library of Congress puts on, and every state has an adult book and a children's book. And for this year, mine is the one from Montana. And of course, there's no funding for it, but we were able to do one event, and they filmed it, and they want to release the video of it so that people can watch it, whether it's book clubs. It's like a book club thing, and I'm supposed to meet with all these book clubs. Whatever. I'm into it. It's going to be awesome. But they called me the other day saying, okay, the video is great, but we want to know if it's okay if we can edit out 2 things that you said. One of them was, and I don't remember the context of this, was I said, I wish the Blackfeet would have killed Lewis and his men when they had a chance, which was like the only time they fought was when Lewis and like 3 or 4 guys had a conflict with some Blackfeet. I said that because Lewis and Clark was like, oh, you can't speak ill of Lewis and Clark in Montana. And then the other thing I said, there was some woman who got up and was like really monologuing about something. I don't even remember. And I said, if we keep talking like this, someone's going to call the cops. So they wanted to cut the line about referring to, I wish the Blackfeet would have killed Lewis and his men. And the line about, if we keep talking like this, people are going to call the cops. Like, what the hell is wrong with those two lines? And they said, well, we just wouldn't want anybody to pick them up and do, run with it and get it out of context. And I said, no, if you cut that, you can't post that anymore. Because if we're so afraid, because yes, humanities has been gutted. They basically don't even exist. And I'm just not willing to do those guys, they don't care what they say and never have. And we tend to yield too much ground. And I'm not afraid of anything anybody said, because I do wish that Blackfeet would have killed Lewis and his men, when you look at the dominoes that have fallen since that, but that's dumb to be willing to cede that ground. Just go, oh, we're afraid someone's going to get mad. Well, let them get mad. Bring it out. Let's have the conversation.
That's an odd thing to be mad about. Lewis brings that on the Natchez.
I know.
But yeah, actually, I'm curious about that, because you're now in the roots of, Lewis and Clark land. You can just follow it all the way up to where you come from. You can start in St. Charles, where there's a gigantic Lewis and Clark with their dog, Seaman. And then I noticed that when I was in Montana, it's like everything Lewis and Clark did.
Everything.
Like, Lewis took a shit. Lewis got tired.
That is literally.
Like, and there's a signpost like every mile.
Yeah.
To designate the most mundane actions of Lewis and Clark. What are your feelings about Lewis and Clark? I mean, I'm just, obviously not a fan. But I was curious. What's your take on that?
I think it was a tremendous thing that they did. We knew, like people say, we knew more about the moon when we sent the people to the moon than we knew about what was happening, or what Jefferson. Don't get me started on Jefferson.
Go ahead, go off on Jefferson.
Ortega. Basically, all those guys on Mount Rushmore that's carved into the most stolen land, visibly stolen land in the country. But I, as a kid, I was into that kind of stuff. Now the political ramifications. I mean, it was a military expedition, and I can appreciate, as someone who has spent time out in the wilds, I can appreciate what they were able to achieve, but they would not have achieved it without a lot of help from Native people, and primarily women in these Native communities. Like the Nez Perce were ready to just, like, when they came out of the Lolo Pass, which I drive over all the time, they were ready to kill them. And it was a woman said, no, we probably shouldn't do that. And that Traveler's Rest is literally, they know Lewis and Clark camped there because of the latrine, because it's full of mercury. Because like their main thing that they took were these thunderbolts. It was like practically pure mercury, and that's what they figure why so many of them died young, is because they ingested all this mercury. But yeah, there's a lot of armchair adventurers that like project their manhood through Lewis and Clark, and I get that. One of the things I loved last year when I was on book tour, and I went up through northern Minnesota, and everything was voyageur this, voyageur that. The voyageurs play a very important part in our history, and I loved seeing that. But do we really need a voyageurs lumber company? Voyageurs bike shop. It was funny when I was driving out to Cahokia. There's a Indian Mounds golf course. Slapping these names on things, but yeah, I don't. It happened, and now it becomes a vehicle for us to talk about other things.
Speaking of, I think, are we on question time, Shane?
Sure.
Okay.
We can just keep talking.
We could. I thought,
Yeah,
if the audience has anything.
I would love it if anybody had any questions or comments.
Well, what you were talking about with, what's a coming 2026? Forget her name, Alexandra.
Ocasio-Cortez.
She said, there absolutely is an unprecedented abuse of power, destruction of norms, erosion of our government, our democracy, in order to prop up authoritarian style governance. This is happening. However, they are weaker than they look. It's important that we remember that, because what they rely on is the impression of power. The perception of inevitability in us giving up in advance to say, oh, what's going to happen if I stand up? Nothing. They rely on the perception of inevitability and power so that people comply in advance, acquiesce in advance, and give up in advance. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump is at record levels of unpopularity in his tenure. The Republican House is at record levels of unpopularity. They're underwater across the board and they know it. And that is causing them to double down in public. But it's backfiring. And that was just in comment to what you're saying, like their public display of like just ridiculous comments and then starting to backfire. You know, that the more we can come together and say, like, it does matter what we do and what we say, and, you know, like seeing, you know, different languages across the country and like how impactful that is, and like how do we establish more of like what they're doing in Montana and other countries, or other states, and, you know, remembering the history of different peoples and different languages spoken.
One of the curious things that I recently read was one of the, I mean, if you're going to have a silver lining to something like boarding schools, is that, you know, they brought kids from all these tribes from everywhere and put them in one place and made them speak one language. So you had people from, which was English. But now what you have is you have all these people from different tribal communities that were speaking entirely different, you know, like Siouan versus Algonquin languages, you know, these that are just like this, the languages. If you go north through the Flatheads, it's Salish, and you go south, it's Kootenai. They're totally different. Yet when you force everybody to speak English, now all of a sudden they're like, your struggle's just like ours. We thought you guys were this, and the reality is you're facing the same thing that we have been. So now you created a communication network that allows things like the American Indian movement to arise, and things like that, because people now are able to connect through shared experience that they weren't ever able to really communicate with one another. You know, that's if I had one or the other, but if the boarding schools never happened and we figured out another way to resist, but that is part of it. Finding these ways in the midst of oppression to resist is what it comes down to.
Do you feel like they have, you know, what kind of power do you feel like this government has? I'm always interested in this sort of Ocasio-Cortez type critiques. They're like, no, they're very weak. Because on one hand, I'm like, they are weak at what they seek to be weak at, as in they don't see the need for geopolitical acumen in certain arenas, but they will use force and they will seize power and they will break treaties. And a lot of their methods are the same methods that this government has traditionally employed against indigenous people, you know, which is why you see these comparisons between Trump and, say, Andrew Jackson. It's a lawlessness. It's a federal level of lawlessness, and it's very difficult to combat that because the courts don't matter. A lot of these traditional mechanisms don't matter. Like, what's your take on this? Is this a weak government, or is it just sort of a like more nuanced kind of form of power?
I think it's powerful in some ways. Like, there's certainly a lot of power in sending like unidentified thugs in to kidnap people. That's a kind of power that you have to recognize and figure out a way to resist that. But even like the things that I mean, you bring up a great point with Andrew Jackson, and Rebecca Nagel writes about it in, you know, By the Fires We Carry. At the time of Indian removal, the Cherokee had you know, worked public opinion such that the public opinion was opposed to Indian removal. The Supreme Court said, you can't do this. And Andrew Jackson said, stop me, and did it anyway. So when people say, it's never been like this, Trump can't do this, like, well, this is just a playbook. This is it operating how it was designed to be all along. What we're seeing is not an aberration or an anomaly. This is just the latest flex of how this system was set up from the beginning. And I think more people need to recognize that. It's not going to, if we win the midterms, everything's going to be okay. We're going to stop. But yeah, that's a first step. But we still have to recognize, you know, the recipe in the cake, you know, and let's make pie instead. So that's one of the things, like for us, Little Shell, you know, our government was destroyed when we lost everything and became literally known as the Landless Indians for more than 150 years. And we were at a point where we have to rebuild everything from the ground up. And I hope we are smarter about that than I'm fearing that we're the path we're on. But that's kind of where we are. We have to look at every single thing. I got a bunch of heat like in the last month before the election, because the Indian Collective out of South Dakota wrote this great essay saying, yeah, we're against all of these people running, but we recognize that these people are less bad, but you need to realize that anybody that gets elected becomes your opponent. You have to be in opposition to the decisions they make if they are not good for your community. Is basically what it boils down to. And I shared that, and I believe that. And there were a bunch of people who don't understand the difference between being an opponent and an enemy. If we started playing Scrabble together, it's for blood, and you're my opponent. But, when I probably lose mightily, I would still happily go have a cheeseburger or a beer or whatever it is we do. So you can be an opponent and still be community, and I think people forget that.
Healthy discourse.
Healthy discourse, yes.
We do have a question from the virtual audience. Studio G Code is asking to please tell us more about the tattoos and the grandfathers.
Yeah, so the 7 grandfather teachings or 7 grandmother teachings, depending on which part of the Anishinaabe land place you're living in. It's like our code for how we're supposed to live our life. So if we follow these 7 teachings, and each of one is represented by a particular older than human relative. So we have Migizi, the bald eagle, who is the symbol for love. And then we have Magua, the bear, who is the symbol for courage. And we have a Mick, the beaver, who is the symbol for wisdom. And Gagagi, the raven, is a symbol for honesty. But depending on where you are, it might be Sabe, who's Bigfoot, the forest man, is a representative for honesty, which proves that he exists and has been around for a long time. We've got Nisquatacy, the painted turtle, who's a representative for truth. And we have Mahingun, the wolf, who is the representative for humility. And finally, Bijiki, Mashkade Bijiki, the buffalo, who is the representative of respect. And the idea being that if you live your best and they all kind of tie together, then you're living in an Anishinaabe life. And the little shell, we adopted that as like our code as well when we were restored. And I forget stuff unless it's tattooed on my body. And I just like to have this as a reminder. And I'm failing any given day on 4 or 5 of them at a time, but it's just a matter of just trying to be better about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Really enjoying the conversation. Maybe responding to 2 things you commented on. One was about having your attention kind of be on things you can control, but then also representation in some media and movies. What are some stuff that you enjoy in terms of film or movies that you kind of go back to? Maybe even some diamonds in the rough, from maybe as things that were influential on you.
Well, so there's 2 answers to this. The Lily Gladstone's a friend of mine, and she should have won the Oscar. She used to text me when she was in LA as a struggling actor saying, hey, I gave your number to unemployment. They call you, tell them I was looking to you for a job, because I used to do some photography here and there. So her success, I love seeing that, especially the kind of indie films that she's been in. Sherman Alexi's an asshole, but he gave us Smoke Signals, which is one of my favorite movies. As far as that kind of representation of seeing Indians doing Indian things and what it was like. But then there's the stuff that I love that, Last of the Mohicans might be my favorite movie, and it's problematic as hell, but I love that movie. The Warriors, the gangs from the 70s, and that's one of my favorite movies. I have these, one of the things you start to get really radicalized as an Indigenous person, you have to realize that you're having an American experience too, which is what Greg Deal, who's the front man for the Indigenous punk band Dead Pioneers, talks about in one of the songs. It's like, yeah, I'm a native, but I'm having an American experience too. And there's all these things in my childhood that shaped me. Dungeons and Dragons, so I have all of these things. You can think, well, that's not very Indian, but it's part of my experience. So yeah, Powwow Highway is a good one. You can track that one down.
maybe memento with the tattoos.
Oh, that's right, to remind himself. Yeah, I forgot about that. Good point. Yes, I saw that. That's the movie that starts at the end and works its way back to the beginning, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to your idea of the land giving you knowledge when you go out and spend time in nature, what are your favorite things to do? What do you hope to get out of spending time in nature? Do you look at trees? Are you looking at the insects? What do you like to do?
Yes. All of those. I like to just find it, like, well, I like to walk. But I like to just find a spot and sit. And you know, you do that anywhere in the wild, and the wild could be a wetland behind a convenience store, which was a place when I was living in Missoula one time that I would just go and there were benches and I would sit. And once the world around you realizes you're not there to like thrower the whole thing, it starts to come alive around you, and you start realizing there's an ant pile right there that I didn't notice, or you know, there's a turtle on this log, or there's, you know, a heron just stopped frozen still right there. So the world comes to you when you just immerse yourself in it, and that's what I try and do, you know. And it's been a gift so many times. And then, you know, this isn't the happiest story, but this place, Council Grove, that I go to, and I write about it pretty extensively in the book. It's where the Hellgate Treaty of 1855 was signed, which created the CSKT reservation and forced the removal of the Salish from the Bitterroot Valley and forced them north. And my tribe doesn't have a reservation, but it's also known as the Flathead Reservation. I call that my step reservation because we don't have one, and I spend a lot of time there. But Council Grove is like the place I go to, and it's got all of these old growth ponderosa pines. Some of them are old enough to have been there when this hugely important event, probably the second most important event to happen in the Missoula Valley as long as there's been people there. That was one of them, the Hellgate Treaty. And that is a place I go and just have been so connected to it. I've had all of these experiences. Well, last summer, we had this windstorm like no one has ever seen before. Like hurricane winds came up the valley and like took down more than 1,000 trees in Missoula, and I lost a couple trees in my yard, and Council Grove was just devastated. And I didn't go for weeks because I was afraid of what it looked like. And there were a couple trees in particular that I was afraid were lost. And so when I finally went back, I went, and one of them that I was concerned about that I called a condominium tree, because there's all these cavities and then there's so many different species who live there. It was still standing, but it's just like this old snag with no living branches to catch that wind, you know? And then I went around the trail, and there was this one great big ponderosa that I spent a lot of time with that, you know, I considered my friend. And this tree was down, you know, this probably 300-year-old or older tree was down, and I was just crushed. And you know, I walked by it, and you know, they cut it so that the trail could still go through. And I always put my hand on it, and I think, you know, how many centuries would I have to walk and put my hand here to where it would start to show the imprint, like these temples, because that place is a temple to me. These temple stairs that are worn down because so many pilgrims have gone up and down them. And, you know, in my sorrow, I was feeling like, you know, I don't even want to go back there. And then I thought, what, you know, that place has given me so much. Who am I if I now turn my back on it when it needs something from me? So I make a point. It's hard because I'm on the road a lot, but I do go back there. I do try and feel whatever it feels like to give some kind of energy back to this place because it has given so much to me. And so that is that reciprocal relationship. It's not so much about what these places are doing, but it's me trying to somehow send a message that, you know, I'm not just here to take, I want to give. Tell me what it is I need to give, you know?
Yeah, I just want to say that's such a beautiful sentiment, and I think that it's something that we need to hold tightly to now, you know, because there is so much destruction, you know, there is so much chaos. We had a lot of these experiences here in St. Louis, you know, with our tornado and the loss of favorite trees or favorite places. And I think your perspective that, you don't abandon them. You don't abandon something just because it's fallen. You don't abandon people just because they're hurt. You don't abandon anything. I think there's a roadmap out of, the political or ecological hell that we're in. It's that, kind of it's unconditional love, even for the battered and, beaten down. I think that might get us through. So yeah, that was just a comment. I don't know how are we doing on time, Shane?
I mean, I could listen to this forever, but I do think maybe we can move to the signing.
Sure.
But let's give a giant round of applause. Thank you for taking this. We do have both Chris's book and Sarah's books available for sale at the desk. So if you would like to get a signed copy, we will be doing the signing right up here. And I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight, for being a part of this incredible event. It is rare that I actually sit down and listen to the entirety of an event, but tonight was really exceptional. So thank
Thanks
you
for coming.
all for being here.
Thank you, Sarah.